So now that we're gathering and storing user input, it's time to use that input with that utility function you find in the investment.js file, this calculate investment results function, to calculate the results we want to show in that table in the end. Now, therefore, of course, we have to answer the question where this function should be used. Where should those results be calculated? Where do we need them? And of course, we could calculate those results in the user input component. There we got this user input object, which conveniently and not by accident has exactly the shape we need as an input for this calculate investment results function, because there we also expect to get an object as an input which has these four properties, which are the four properties I have here. Though if you went for individual state slices, you can of course also simply combine them into such an object by deriving this object based on your state slices. But either way, we could therefore use this function here in the user input component and calculate our results here. But do we need those results in this component? The answer to this question probably is no. Because even though we don't have it yet, I do of course plan to add a separate component for outputting that results table. And that table should then be shown below the user input component. So therefore, since I plan to output the results here in a dedicated component, we'll need to get our user input from the user input component to the app component, so that in here we can calculate those results and pass those results to the results component. Or pass the user input to the results component and calculate the results in there. And that's therefore indeed what I will do here. I'll add a new component, results.jsx is my file, and in there I'll have this function component, which I'll name results. And my goal is to get the user input as an input in this component here, so as props in this results component, so that in this results component I can calculate that results data and output that results table. For the moment, I'll just return a placeholder here, results, which will be replaced later. And I'll start by getting the user input from the user input component to the app component, so that then we can pass it back down to the results component, which we will soon use here. And therefore, what we can do here is we can simply lift this state up from the user input component to the app component. We can cut this state here and add it in the app component function, like this, and then import use state in this file, since we're now using this function here in this app component file. And we'll of course also need to lift this handle change function up. So cut it from user input component and move it into the app component. And now with that, we should add a new prop to the user input component, so that we can call this handle change function from inside the user input component. So we need to pass a pointer to this handle change function as a value to the user input component. And hence I'll add a prop here, which I'll name on change or on change input. The name is up to you because it's your component. Here I'll go for on change. And I'll point at handle change here. So this function, so that this function is passed as a value to user input. And as you learned, you don't call the function here. You don't add parentheses. Instead, you just use it as a value. And with that in the user input component, we can accept this prop and destructure it here, the onChange prop which I just added, and get rid of this import since we're not managing state in here anymore. And now this onChange prop here will hold a function because we're passing a function as a value to onChange. And hence we can call onChange as a function in here. And therefore in this anonymous function here, where we previously called handleChange, I'll now call onChange, which is the same function in the end, now just received through a prop. And I'll do this for all those inputs, calling onChange to, in the end, pass this data to the app component and there to the handleChange function. But of course, in the user input component, we also need that user input. We need that user input object to update the values of these input fields. And therefore, of course, we should also accept a second prop here, maybe named user input, so that we don't have to make any changes down there in the JSX code. And this should now be a prop that should get this user input object as a value. Therefore, back in the app component, we now also must set this user input prop on the user input component and set this equal to this user input state here, so that it's this object that's passed as a value for that user input prop to the user input component. And I know that's a lot of user inputs. We could of course also choose a different name here for the prop and also for the state if we wanted to. You can rename all these things. But with that, we now lifted this user input state here up from the user input component to the app component, and we're doing this so that we can now also pass this user input to the results component. So that in there we also get a prop, and here I'm again using prop destructuring to store that prop in a separate variable. And here we can also name it user input or just input to mix things up. And then in here, for the moment, I'll just console log input. And with that back in the app component, below the user input component, I now do want to output that results component. And for that, of course, you must import results from this results.jsx file. And then on this results component, we should set this input prop, which I just added kind of to this results component function, and set this equal to this user input state. The same user input state we're also passing to the user input component, so that we're sharing this state with two different components in the end, two different components that both need that state. Well, and with that, if you save all your files in the app, you'll see this results text down there, which at the moment is just a placeholder, of course. But more importantly, if you open the developer tools, you'll see an object being logged here, which is in the end that user input state object. And therefore, of course, also if I clear this and I change the input here, you see that this gets updated and we get the updated object being logged here with that updated annual investment amount of 1,500 in this case. So passing that user input to the results component works, and with that we can now derive the results data in that results component.